Welcome, everyone. I'm Mark Keppler, the director of the Maddy Institute. We're very fortunate today to have two phenomenal speakers who know the ins and outs of the California legislature and what's happening in Sacramento. So we're absolutely delighted to have them with us today, and they are on a very, very tight, busy schedule. We have Laurel Rosenhall, who is now the Sacramento bureau chief for the LA Times, takes over for John Myers, and following in some great footsteps there. They've done phenomenal work and encourage you to follow the LA Times. We've also got Dan Walters. He almost needs no introduction. He's been around since before computers, I think.
Before God.
So Dan is kind of the go-to person. I've often joked that, I could actually ask Dan's, state politics, what's up with that? And just sit back and let him talk for 30 minutes, which is kind of what we're going to do today. So with that, I don't want to take up any time because I know you're here not to hear me talk, but to hear Laurel and Dan talk. So I want to start off with maybe Laurel, you can kind of begin the conversation with maybe a quick review of the November election. What's your takeaway from the results?
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me. As far as my look back on 2022, I think when it comes to Governor Gavin Newsom, the obvious takeaway is that the recall election of 2021 really took all the energy out of the governor's race in the election year. Newsom barely, campaigned in California. We saw him develop this new strategy of taking the fight to red states, fueled by conservative Supreme Court decisions on abortion and gun control, developing his feuds with Texas and Florida. And even at home, he seemed to be campaigning more against the oil industry than against any Republican politicians. So the governor's race was, really altered by it took the wind out of the sails because of the recall. In the legislature, this last year was a year of tremendous churn. There was kind of a historic number of resignations and retirements, partly because of redistricting, partly because COVID really changed dynamics in the state capitol and made the job of being a legislator a lot less fun, I think. And so there was a huge amount of vacant seats and a lot of turnover in this election. We also saw some restlessness among the members and an attempt to take the speaker out and put in a new speaker. There was sort of a standoff over that. And then they eventually decided to put the new speaker in place next year in about 6 months. So there was a lot of change in there, not really in the partisan balance, but more just in the, in the actual people who will be in the legislature. It's still, the Democrats still have more than a supermajority control. And then in local races, I observed a lot of anti-incumbent energy sort of throughout the year. In San Francisco, there was, of course, the school board recall and the district attorney recall. In Los Angeles, there was no recall, but voters in the regular election got rid of their sheriff, the incumbent sheriff, and voted in a bunch of new city council members. So there was a lot of anti-incumbent kind of energy. The last thing I would say as far as looking back at 2022 is that the Supreme Court ruling overturning Roe versus Wade, I think had a big impact on politics this year because we saw initiatives in several states that almost all broke on the side of voters voting with abortion rights. That ruling led to first of its kind legislation passing in Congress last week with the Same-Sex Marriage Act that Biden is supposed to sign into law tomorrow. And it remains to be seen how much a change of this drastic nature by the Supreme Court will shape politics in the year to come.
So Dan, what's your takeaway on the races, the November election results?
Well, as Laurel said, the Democrats still have their super majorities. In fact, I think that the net so far, there's still one race, so a couple of them just kind of in a little bit of down. Democrats will have picked up 2 seats in the Assembly and 1 in the Senate. And I think 63 seats now in the Senate and 31, I think, in the Senate. 63 in the Assembly and 31 in the Senate, something like that. And that's not only super majorities; those are super duper majorities. And the effect of that is that the possibility that the Democratic leaderships in both houses can move bills with 2/3 votes and have enough of a margin in their membership that they can let a few people off the hook, so to speak, from swing districts, so they could move probably some legislation that might otherwise not be able to move with only 2/3 vote majorities. So I think we'll see the outcome, but there is some rumbling that it's time to do some big systemic changes in the political system of California, and the Democrats may have the votes to do that sort of thing. One thing that's being kicked around, for example, is to perhaps change the thresholds for putting initiatives and referenda on the ballot. We're seeing there's a lot of sense that in today's atmosphere, the ballot is mostly used by those right of center to counteract what the legislature is doing left of center. So if the left of center Democrats can change the system to make it more difficult for those on the right of center to use the ballot, and particularly referenda, to overturn some laws passed by the legislature, that we may see some action in that regard. So when you say, what does the super duper majority give you? It might give you the opportunity to make some really fundamental changes in the political structure of California, if they're so inclined to do so. I think we also should not get away without mentioning the ballot measures. We had actually fewer ballot measures than we usually have this year, but some very significant ones. Of course, the one that sucked all the oxygen out of the air were the dueling measures on on sports wagering that both went down in flames. And after spending $500 million or something on the campaigns. But I think there were a couple of them that others were pretty significant. Maybe including the one that was going to raise marginal income tax rates on the wealthiest taxpayers to pay for climate change things. That looked like it was going to go, which was not surprising considering that voters in the past have been willing to tax the rich for specific issues. But the governor weighed in against it, and that seemed to sink it, and it sank pretty handily. And there's some bad feeling among environmental groups and others who sponsored that ballot measure that the governor weighed in on behalf of, as they would say, on behalf of the Republican and the rich, so to speak. And it's engendered some resentment among people who would ordinarily be Gavin Newsom supporters. So, but we're already gearing up for 2024. There are already a ballot measure or two. It's already qualified. There's others headed that way. We're going to have another round of high dollar ballot measures, including perhaps referenda on the oil well measure that the legislature passed on perhaps his profit, putting a penalty on high profits from the oil industry. That could go to a referendum in 2024, conceivably. And of course, the measure that sets up a really groundbreaking effort to control wages and working conditions for fast food workers that the governor signed, that's already headed for the ballot for sure in 2024. And by the way, any measure that, any referendum that qualifies to overturn a law passed by the legislature puts that law on hold until it's settled by the voters. So it's, for example, on the fast food measure, that fast food law will not be able to go into effect for a couple of years, even if it survives the referendum, because those things are automatically put on hold until the voters have the way. So it's actually, as we point out in a CalMatters article today, it's actually economically positive for corporations that are dinged by the legislature to go ahead and do a referendum, even if they don't really win, because they get 2 more years of doing whatever they're doing. For example, one of the referenda on the ballot this year was to overturn a ban on flavored tobacco products. That failed, but it actually stalled out then that law going into effect until the voters could decide. Very interesting. That's a game that we will see increasing use of going forward, because the legislature seems to be moving left and more likely to pass these corporate governance measures like the fast food thing. And so we'll probably see more referenda as a result of that.
Yeah, that is a great point, Dan. One of the things I noticed on Prop 31 on the cigarette and vaping, they spent, cigarette company spent $20 million to get that on the ballot. But once it got on the ballot, they only spent 1.7 million to get it passed. So it doesn't sound like they were really serious about getting it passed, but it did what they wanted it to do, which that is delay implementation for 2 years. And they're saying that they ended up making $1.1 billion on that 22 million total investment. That's a good return on investment. I guess it's a smart business decision.
Yeah, it doesn't take a rocket science to figure out that it's money well spent if you can delay a law of that magnitude for 2 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the next
Laura,
day.
yeah, I wanted to ask you what you thought of the propositions and all of this.
Oh, I was going to make the same point. Then the day after the election, they were ready to go with a lawsuit to try to block it with an injunction from the court. So yeah, it does kind of all add up to make it look like it was all about a, delaying tactic rather than actually trying to defeat the thing with the voters. No, I agree that the most interesting thing with the propositions is this trend that we're seeing cemented, which is that big corporations unhappy with decisions coming out of the progressive legislature are using the referendum process to for payback, to try to get the law overturned or to delay it. We saw this several years ago with the plastic bag ban. Didn't work. Voters upheld the plastic bag law, but that was kind of the that was an early sign of where this thing was heading. And then we saw the bail industry do it a couple years later. And then we saw the tobacco industry do it this year. And now we have fast food and oil working on referendums for the 2024 ballot. So, but the other remarkable thing about the propositions this year was just the insane amount of money that the sports wagering, the sports betting measures spent, record busting sums of money between the two of them, about $500 million, and didn't help them at all. I mean, one of those two, I think only got 17 or 18% yes votes. I mean, I don't know, I can't even remember something that got so little support. So that was just kind of amazing how so much money and yet so little love from the voters.
Yeah, and that, I think that's it brings up something that we always kind of forget about politics. We talk about a lot of money being spent in politics and political campaigns, either for ballot measures, against ballot measures, for candidates, against candidates. But the stakes involved in those decisions are quantumly higher than the money you spent. So if you spend $500 million, as they did in these Indian gaming measures, if you could win one, the stakes are billions of dollars, many billions of dollars, almost countless billions of dollars. So while it sounds like a lot of money being spent, it's really pocket lint compared to the stakes involved in the outcome. And that's what encourages people to invest in politics, whether it's investing in terms of lobbying and campaign contributions or whatever. The decisions that are made by voters and legislators have immense economic consequences. Therefore, there is the motivation to try to influence those decisions because there's simply so much money at stake in them.
It might be a new revenue stream for newspapers and TV stations, a way to get rich, because a lot of money is going to be spent on these going forward. Dan, I noticed that you had written about the fact that California's congressional races were a virtual draw. The Democrats were hoping to pick up some seats, and we've got a situation with Valadeo won yet again in a Democrat, a majority Democratic registered district. You got John Duarte defeating Adam Gray. What's your takeaway of the congressional races in California?
My takeaway is that the Democrats didn't do what they needed to do in California to offset their losses in other states. That was particularly true in the congressional race in the suburbs of Los Angeles when Mike Garcia was reelected fairly handily. He had barely won re-election before, and it's been three times against the same candidate. It's kind of been weird. And afterwards, his opponent complained that despite the voter registration edge that Democrats had, the Democratic Party did not put any effort into getting her elected and defeating Mike Garcia. There's a lot of bitterness about that. And I think that's up and down the state. You're seeing some resentment by Democrats that the National Democratic Party did not invest in California enough money to make a difference in the national lineup in the end. I mean, it was a bit going in, the Democrats thought they could pick up as many as 5 seats in California. Well, they didn't. And that could have been the margin of in the nation as a whole.
Weren't they targeting 5 Republican seats and they didn't pick up any of them?
Didn't pick up any of them. I think maybe 6, but they didn't pick up any of them. Still, they oddly enough, the Republicans, as badly as they did in legislative elections in other ways, did pretty well in congressional elections in California this year under the circumstances, where they were looking at a multi-seat loss going in, and they came out with virtual parity. I think they may have picked up a seat in net terms. So the Democrats kind of fell on their faces on the congressional races in California.
And they can't attribute that to gerrymandering, because we have an independent citizens review commission that sets up the districts. So
well, more so, it wasn't a gerrymander, but the districts that were drawn by the Independent Redistricting Commission in California favored Democrats. The actual numbers on the seats that came out should have made a Democratic gain in California. As they got a gain in legislative seats, they should have had a gain in congressional seats by the numbers, and they didn't get it. And I think that was a failing on the part of the National Democratic Party not to pay as much attention to California as they needed, which is ironic given that Nancy Pelosi is from California and Kevin McCarthy is from California.
Right. By the way, and I do know that our Republican friends think that maybe the Citizens Redistricting Commission isn't neutral, though it was designed to be that way. We'll let you make that argument later. But I want to turn attention to this change in leadership in the House. Both Californians, very different. A Democratic liberal from San Francisco being replaced by a Valley conservative Republican. Any implications for California, Laurel?
Well, I think most remarkably, it's a rare chance for Red California to really have power at the national level. We've seen most of the powerful figures from California have been Democrats. And so this will be a really interesting turning over of the power to kind of give power to the Republican parts of the state. I don't know with a divided government that there will be a massive policy outcome. But I am very interested to see on the political side how much those parts of the state that have felt very disempowered and very much in the political minority, if there's any feeling of greater relevance or greater power on the national level.
Yeah. Also have to remember that we don't know for certain that Kevin McCarthy is going to become a speaker. It's still
right. Let's assume for sake of argument that he is. But the Republicans did fairly well in the Valley, right? With Valadeo and Duarte. Does that mean some of the issues that are important to the Valley, like agriculture in Kern County and oil and energy, that's going to have some policy implications at the federal level? I would say that you could look for the possibility, particularly on oil, that particularly if Kevin McCarthy is elected speaker, that you'll see some efforts in Congress to blunt the efforts in California to do away with the oil industry. That's official policy in California, is do away with the oil industry. And I think you'll see some kickback on that from Congress if, in fact, there's an avenue for them to thwart those efforts. Yeah, Laura, I want to ask you about, looking back at 2022 in the legislature and the governor, what do you see as his biggest successes of the governor and his biggest losses?
Policy-wise, a big success for him was getting this Care Court thing across the finish line. Care Court is this plan that the governor came up with to compel treatment for people who are mentally ill. It's supposed to address, some of the most sort of extreme cases of homelessness, although it could also apply to people who have severe mental illness who are not homeless. So that would be a very big success in the policy arena. And again, in terms of bills, a big failure was, he had this really ambitious gun control agenda that he pushed through the legislature this year. And one piece of it, which was a pretty significant one because it responded to a Supreme Court ruling on concealed carry limitations, failed in the legislature, could not get the 2/3 support that that was required for that particular bill, because it was written with an urgency clause. So in the state capitol, I would say those are the two big pieces of legislation, win and loss.
And then you have the AG just came out saying he's going to back away from supporting the governor on this gun legislation that concerns basically taxing folks, penalizing folks for guns, ammunition, et cetera. Dan, what's your takeaway from the governor's year in review, positive, negative report card, maybe?
Well, his biggest positive, of course, is getting himself reelected in a landslide. You can't set aside that, although certainly no doubt that was going to occur. I think this is not exactly a win or a loss, but I think one of the more interesting episodes had to do with the bill that would have helped the United Farm Workers Union win representation elections by allowing mail votes, and rather than have in person.
Dan, do you really think that's going to make a difference? The United Farm Workers represent less than 1% of farm workers.
Well, if they got 2%, they would have a 100% increase.
That is true.
I think they're in rock bottom. They are absolutely in rock bottom. They need desperately to have something to get some membership. The legislature has made a number of efforts to try to help them. Nothing seems to have worked. This is the latest one, but I think the interesting about that is the governor vetoed that bill once. It came back in slightly different form, almost identical, slightly different. And he said he was going to, basically, he didn't say he was going to veto, but his office put out that he opposed the bill, he opposed the bill, he opposed the bill. But when push came to shove, he signed the bill after the UFW got the president of the United States to weigh in on him. And I have a hunch that the Biden White House takes a little glee in forcing Gavin Newsom to back down on that bill, because Newsom was making some real noises at one time about wanting to run for president. Or never said he wanted to, but he was making noises like he was going to, and even suggested at one point that Biden was not up to the job. So I think the White House took a little glee in making Gavin Newsom sit up and bark, so to speak, and by signing that bill.
It seems that the UFW, while they're really not maybe an economic force, in terms of labor relations and collective bargaining, they are still a pretty vibrant political force in the state legislature. Let me turn our attention to, let's see here, federal level. There's also, you've got a pretty activist Supreme Court, more active than they've been, in recent memory. I'm just wondering, maybe Laurel, you can try to take this question. Any decisions that are pending before the court that are likely to have big implications for California?
I know that there's one that is related to the pork industry that stems from a California law that was kind of an animal rights ballot measure from several years ago. So that one would be directly involving us. I've been interested in this independent state legislature theory that they're talking about. It's brought from a Republican legislature I don't see that it's likely to immediately change anything in California, but it just has had me kind of wondering, given that we are also a very, I don't know that it would have any impact here, but it has made me think about kind of how do these decisions play out when you have a legislature from the other, the other side. I don't, because we have independent redistricting, I think in the end, it probably is irrelevant in California, but it has had me thinking about the huge role that legislatures play in other parts of our government.
Yeah, Dan, what do you think?
I think the case involves is whether a legislature has the ultimate power, basically, to make election laws, including redistricting. And if the Republican position holds true in the Supreme Court, if they win that case, that legislatures have unfettered power over election laws. What it could do in California is allow the legislature essentially to eliminate the redistricting commission. that the legislature then could say, hey, the Supreme Court says we have the ultimate power to draw these seats. Therefore, we're going to get rid of this independent commission that gives the Republicans too much power and gives it, and we will take some more seats we'll redo redistricting like we used to do redistricting. There was actually a columnist over the weekend who essentially advocated that. It said that by doing good government in California with an independent redistricting commission, Republicans get too much out of that. They get more seats than they should have. So there's a possibility that if the Supreme Court would validate the idea of a legislative power, that the California legislature could perhaps just simply grab back the redistricting authority that it once had.
Yeah, the unintended consequences, or is it the devil you know is better, right? I want to ask you, Laura, what about, we were talking earlier about the governor, and I was thinking he does protest too much about not running for president. Still seems like that's on his radar screen, obviously, but he's going to be dealing with a budget deficit, not going to be able to make some of those, at least fund some of those ambitious ideas. How do you think that is all going to play into how the governor acts in 2023?
I mean, Newsom's been, I feel like, operating on both a governing and campaigning two-track system for a long time. So I don't expect him to kind of back away from his interest in being a sort of warrior for the left worldview on the national stage. Whether or not he ends up running for president, he's made it clear that he wants to kind of be in the fight representing this progressive worldview and trying to help Democrats bring a louder fight to Republican states that he disagrees with. So I anticipate that we will continue to see Newsom both, do the nuts and bolts of governing with the budgets and the bills and all of that, and then also be out there campaigning in the way that he wants to, even if it's not exactly for president.
Yeah, I've been reading things that some people say that he's really going to be focusing on implementation because he doesn't like the narrative, this crime-ridden, overpriced state with lots of homeless. So he's implemented all these ideas. There has to be some change. There has to be some positive result. Dan, what do you think?
I think that's absolutely right. Assuming he's not running for president next year, which seems very unlikely, particularly because Biden's looking more and more like he's going to be running for re-election. He's thrown all these things out. Laurel mentioned Care Court. There are a bunch of other things that he's gotten launched. Overhauling the Medicaid program, what we call Medi-Cal in California, to be an all-person system. Early childhood education. There's a whole bunch of things that he's launched as governor, and none of them has happened yet. And so the question is, will all of these things turn out to be successful, or will they be a bust? And plus the fact he does have to deal with the potential of some fairly serious budget deficits particularly if we have a recession. And he, while still maintaining a national image of some kind for some reason. And I'm going to add, there's one other thing that he has to deal with potentially, and that is the potential that Dianne Feinstein will not be running for re-election in 2024 to the Senate, or even the maybe remote possibility that she would resign before then. He would have to decide whether he wants to segue into the Senate in 2024, if that comes to pass. And that's just another political decision point. And then maybe he doesn't want to do that. Maybe he just wants to serve out his term and go back to peddling wine. I don't know. But as I've said before, Gavin Newsom has spent half of his life climbing up the political ladder, one rung at a time, from a commission appointment in San Francisco back in the late 90s, to a board seat on the Board of Supervisors, to mayors, to the lieutenant governorship, and now the governorship. It would seem strange to me that he would just simply say, okay, I've had enough. I want to go back to peddling wine again. And whether it's a Senate seat or a presidential run in 2028 or something, I just can't believe he's going to just give it up and go back to private life.
Let's turn our attention to 2023 and what do you think the big issues are going to be in front of the state legislature? Is it going to be more, housing, homelessness, crime, other issues? Laurel, what do you think? What are going to be the big issues that the legislature and the governor are going to try to tackle?
Yeah, I think that housing and homelessness is going to continue to be huge as long as our streets continue to look the way they do in cities up and down the state. This is going to be a top of mind issue for voters, which is going to make it something that the politicians will have to keep working on. And Newsom himself said when he was campaigning that he wanted to build millions more units of housing. I can't remember the exact number right now, but the bottom line is we're nowhere even close to the target that he had set. So both of those issues are going to be big. I think that, it's going to be a big deal for this legislature to respond to the new budget reality. It's been multiple years of very robust budgets and the ability to do a lot of things that they wanted to do for a long time. As Dan mentioned, expanding the Medi-Cal healthcare program, expanding preschool for all 4-year-olds. They've been able to do a lot. And those things are all kind of on a graduated phase-in calendar. So how much does the budget dynamic scale back their ambitions? Does it slow down the progress on these things that have already been launched? And how far do they go in sort of facilitating Newsom's war on the oil industry? I mean, there's really no other way to say it. He has made it clear that he wants to do some sort of penalty. He kind of has already shifted from talking about it as a tax that would require 2/3 support from the legislature to a penalty that would require a simple majority. So, depending on how much support the details are still pretty fuzzy. So that will be a big one that will take up a lot of energy because there's a special session organized around that issue. So those are a few biggies that I see.
Yeah, Dan, I want you to, if you would follow up on that special session on the oil and gas industry. I know it's important to our friends all over the state, but certainly in Kern County. What are your thoughts on that? They're going to pick that back up in January. What's likely to happen there?
It's not going to happen. If it happens, it's not going to happen in January. It's going to take a while. The way it's structured, he put in the bill, but the guts of the bill, which is what would be the allowable profit margin and what the penalties would be for exceeding that margin, are still literally are in the bill blanks to be filled in later. So a lot of it's going to depend on how low those profit margins are or how high the penalties are and that sort of thing. But to get back to something Laurel mentioned, look, I think right now in California, politicians at all levels, whether you're the governor, whether you're a legislator, or whether you're the brand spanking new mayor of Los Angeles, everybody's going to be judged on this homelessness thing. This thing has reached it's reached a critical point a long time ago, but it's reached a critical point in the public consciousness that says, we better see some action on this thing. You guys have been talking about it all this time that you're going to do something about it. You've spent billions of dollars. When are we going to start seeing it happen? And I think there is a kind of a hinge point, a point of no return, that they had better start showing some real results on this homelessness situation, or else. Or this could be the sort of thing like the Proposition 13 was triggered by property taxes in 1978. This could be one of those things that changes the political dynamics of California if the current crop of politicians, almost all of whom are Democrats, at the city level, the county level, at the state level, they'd better come up with something on this thing or the voters are going to punish them. At some point, they are going to be punished by this.
Yeah, I want to also mention I was doing some research and I found that the oil and gas companies spent about $8 million backing moderate Democrats and Republicans that got elected. I think that's kind of a pretty big impact on what happens with that special session. But I want to ask you, Dan, now, the Assembly Republicans have come up with a package of proposals. I'm just wondering if any of these are going to get traction. They're talking about spending the state gas tax, offering property tax bonuses to local governments that approve more housing, dealing with homelessness by banning homeless encampments near schools, increasing penalties for fentanyl dealers, giving working families a tax credit, expanding the renter's tax credit, promoting transparency in school curriculum, expediting environmental review for water storage projects, et cetera. Any of these can have any traction that it might see some compromise and some movement on?
Well, I think there are some of those things that the Democrats could probably embrace, such as removing some of the barriers to housing construction. I think that's something that Democrats, a lot of them want to do as well. Yeah, I think there's some things there in the broadest sense that could have some bipartisan appeal. I don't think that the specific things the Republicans want to do with Republican authors and get them through bills and sign the law will probably happen. Democrats aren't going to let the Republicans up off the mat, so to speak. But I think there's on some of those topics, at least, I think there's some opportunity there for some bipartisanship, if you will, particularly on the housing issue. That seems to be something that pretty much crosses party lines. I mean, the most vociferous advocates of lowering barriers to housing are Democrats. I mean, that's not something the Republicans invented. That's something the Democrats have basically championed, including the governor. They haven't made it happen yet, basically, but they have championed it nevertheless.
It always seems like Scott Wiener is always proposing something when it comes to housing, it seems like.
Yeah, and the latest one is to let churches build housing on their property with, a right to build without any red tape, so to speak.
Right, and also reducing some of the parking requirements. Laura, you want to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that addressing the scourge of fentanyl is another area where will see bipartisan interest. The parties aren't going to have the same approach on everything, but I think there will be overlapping areas. So, for example, you mentioned specifically increasing penalties. I don't think Democrats are going to get behind that because, in general, they're not generally not in favor of anything that's going to increase the prison population or have people be in prison longer. But I do think, for example, we already saw just last week when the legislature convened for the first time, a Democrat and a Republican both separately introduced legislation that would require schools to have Narcan on site to reverse overdoses. This is following several horrible and high-profile overdoses of teenagers and in some cases in Los Angeles on school campus, and others in other venues. So that is one area where it was kind of interesting to see that on day one of the new legislature, a Republican and a Democrat both came up with the same proposal, separate bills, same idea.
By the way, someone's asking if this is being recorded. It is, and we do post it on our website after the event. I wanted to ask you before we open up the questions, and please feel free to put your questions in the chat room. We'll get to as many as we can. Was wondering about what you were thinking, Dan, what might be some of the overlooked or underreported stories in the upcoming year? I mean, one thing I'm thinking about, frankly, is who gets appointed as a state auditor. Elaine Howell was a state auditor for a long time. Michael Tipton was the acting state auditor. He's not going to get the position, someone else is. That's a pretty important position in terms of oversight of state government. They've done some high-profile investigations of unemployment compensation, the UC, high-speed rail, et cetera. But there are other things too. Change in advisors that the governor's had. Just recently, the Secretary of Labor and Workforce Development stepped down. What do you see as kind of the big stories that might be overlooked in 2023?
Well, I think the thing about the auditor is very interesting. Yes, there is some underground buzz about that auditors, that the people in the auditor's office believe that because the acting auditor is not going to be, they worry about politicization of that office, frankly. And it's always had the same kind of independence that the legislative analyst has had, watchdogs on government. And there is a fear among people in that office that there is going to be some sort of a political hack appointed that is going to be less diligent in making audits of things that the Democrats like, and including the governor's program. So we'll see what happens on that. I continue to say that the most underappreciated important story in California and issue in California is the sad state of K-12 education in the state and the very low achievement levels that California's K-12 students are making in statewide and national testing. That's a slow motion crisis that is of immeasurable importance to the future of the state, as well as the futures of the kids that are in that system. We've got to do something about that. The scores that are coming out on academic testing nationally and statewide are just abysmal. And we really need to address that issue. Unfortunately, in the Capitol, about the only time they take up that issue is fighting over how much money the schools are going to get. But it's an issue that goes way beyond money. But that seems to be the debate in the Capitol seems to begin and end with money and nothing else. And I think that is a crisis that is every bit as important as the homelessness crisis, the housing crisis, the water crisis, all these other crises we talk about. It's maybe more important than any of them, in fact, in history, and yet it does not get enough attention.
I think people forget sometimes that K-14 community colleges, that's the biggest part of the state budget, a single item. So it's a big ticket item. Laurel, any topics you think that were kind of might be overlooked that are important that we should be thinking about?
Well, this won't be overlooked once we get into the new year, but there's the question of whether Dianne Feinstein will run for re-election in 2024. She will be in her 90s by then. And so, having an open Senate seat will be kind of the big political story for California, I think, next year. And I wouldn't be surprised if those who want to run start coming kind of out of the shadows in the whisper campaigns and start making their intentions known next year. And that will be a big, wide open kind of free for all. So that'll be very interesting. And then
By the way, Laurel, I should ask you, has she given any indication that she is going to run for re-election?
Yes.
Just not. Well, what have you heard, Dan?
Well, she said she's running for re-election. She's actually said that. And
How long ago?
Within the last 6 months at least.
Really? Okay.
But the whisper campaign is already underway. But, I think even if she does run for re-election, she's probably going to have a primary opponent, a serious primary opponent.
She did have one last time.
Yeah, Kevin DeLeon tried last time and see what happened to him. But anyway, Go ahead, Laura. What else do you think there?
Oh, and then the other I would say more on the kind of under the radar topic would be, whether the legislature makes any moves on changing the initiative, referendum, and recall process. There was much discussion about it after the gubernatorial recall, and there were several proposals. And there were multiple, hearings and academic panels and lots of, studies and whatnot, but they put nothing on the ballot. So there was no change to the recall process that was ever presented. It would be something that to make a significant change in that process, it would have to be approved by voters. But now there's all this concern about these referendums we were talking about, the oil industry and the fast food industry. And I think at the current moment, there's concern about the people using deceptive tactics to get their signatures. So I think it'll be very interesting to see whether that bubbles up into anything more substantive that could be, a change to the direct democracy processes.
It would seem in California, I moved here 35 years ago, and that struck me that the direct democracy in California, I would think, though, as a layperson, that a lot of citizens like that control of being able to go. And I don't want to say it's third rail, but it would be kind of difficult to thread that needle in terms of saying we need to change here.
I don't think there would ever be any attempt to get rid of it, because I agree, that is a very foundational part of politics in our state, is the fact that voters get to weigh in directly on these kinds of issues. But I think that you might see some energy on tinkering with, how the qualification happens. The rules were written 100 years ago when we had a much smaller population, no internet, completely different means of communication. And so it wouldn't surprise me if there is an attempt, but whether, if they poll test it, whether they can get enough support from the voters, you just don't know.
Dan, I know you were around probably when the legislature was created back in late 1800s, but they haven't changed the number, have they?
Well,
The
it's
80
not
assembly
a
members and
number,
40
it's a-
senators, that
it's a
hasn't really
percentage.
changed
It's a
since
percentage.
late
yeah.
1800s, right?
Percentage. Well, it hasn't been late 1800s. Those things came into being in 1912, so it's been
Okay.
10 years. The proportions, I think, have stayed the same. Of course, the numbers vary depending on what your total vote is. I think this is one of those things where the super duper majorities in the legislature might play a role, because you could pass a constitutional amendment with a 2/3 vote in the legislature to place some changes in the system on the ballot, and not have to have a unanimous vote of them, and the governor doesn't have to sign it. It's something that would go on the ballot directly without the governor's involvement. So I think if it's going to happen, it would happen that way. And there is a lot of effort, a big push being made by some unions to change the system to make it more difficult to make these measures on the ballots, because most of the time these measures boil down to business versus unions. And
I'm just
so
thinking, Dan, of all the money that would be involved in such a measure. It boggles the mind.
it does boggle the mind, depending on how much of a change it would be. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a distinct, not a probability, but at least a possibility that there will be a serious move made. They actually have done it in recent years, several changes to the system that were kind of under the radar. They were incremental changes, but basically making it more difficult to qualify measures on the ballot. And I think you'll see at least some incremental efforts, and maybe a big rewrite effort as well.
You know, we've got a few questions I want to get to. One was asked about PG&E. Seems the ongoing issues with PG&E was actually a quote unquote good fire season this year. It wasn't too bad compared to past years. The whole PG&E thing just keeps going and going and going. I think I read something recently. We're talking, billions of dollars that they're going to have to expend to correct the problems. I mean, what's your takeaway, Laurel? Do you have any takeaway with the whole PG&E situation, where that's going, where that's headed?
I have not heard from people recently that this is like on the front burner, so to speak, right now. But I know it's a sort of a perennial issue, and it has been, particularly since Newsom's first term coincided with so many horrible fire seasons, and then the big kind of bailout legislation. So, Dan, have you heard anything about any recent attempts at redoing this?
No, but I think looking ahead, if the costs of making the electrical system fire safe, which means you're undergrounding a lot of these transmission wires, if the costs are what they say they are, somebody's going to have to pay that cost. It could be taxpayers, or it could be ratepayers. And that then would raise the question as to whether the state should pull the trigger on its latent power to take over PG&E, essentially, and make it a public utility. If these costs are as high as they are, I think that whole business of the future of PG&E as a private corporation comes into play.
You think about this, there's uninsulated above ground wires, insulated above ground wires, and underground. And of course, the least expensive is uninsulated above ground. And the vast majority of transmission lines in California are uninsulated above ground. It's kind of shocking that would exist, because you'd think that, well, that could spark a fire. And that's created a lot of problems. We have another question on the redistricting commission, and what your thoughts were on the result. I mean, I was redistricted. I live in Clovis. I have Kevin McCarthy as my congressman, a little bit farther away from his base in Bakersfield. I hope he comes up and visits us in Clovis. But boy, what are your thoughts about the output from that? I think a lot of people in the Valley, particularly in Fresno, were a little upset about how that worked out, because my understanding is we have 4 congressional districts that touch on Fresno, but only one is a Fresno majority district. And so they kind of felt, because there was no one on the commission from Fresno and the Valley, they kind of missed out on some Valley issues.
Well, and that's possible, and you're hearing a lot. Basically, the plan that came out was pro-Democrat, in a sense, in the overall sense, simply because of changes in the demography of California and the sensitivity of the redistricting commission to so-called communities of interest. that was the foremost factor that they drew. So they kind of bypassed the political side of redistricting and the geographic side of redistricting in favor of the community of interest redistricting. And it brought some of the kind of odd results that you mentioned because of that, by trying to encompass as many people from a perceived community of interest in one district as possible. But the effect of it overall was to help Democrats. And this is why it makes their failure to gain congressional seats in California so stark, as it would, because they should have been helped by that plan.
But
Laura,
Dan,
any comments on this?
well, I think you're saying that the effect was to help Democrats because that reflects the population, that reflects the electorate. Isn't that what you're saying, Dan? Yeah, not
well,
because
it reflects the changing demography of California.
Right.
And they were very sensitive to that demography, particularly ethnic and racial communities. But the effect of it, not necessarily the intended effect, but the effect of it was to make the legislative seats and the congressional seats more likely to be Democratic than they were before. That worked out the way it was kind of designed in the legislature, but it did not work out in the congressional seats.
Right. But I guess I would say that there's, I mean, I've heard pushback from the hardcore Democrats who say, if we didn't have this independent redistricting commission, we could have gerrymandered a whole bunch more seats, So, I mean, to the extent that the lines wound up benefiting Democrats, in many cases, that's because it's reflective of the electorate, not that the Democrats had control over it and rigged the game in their favor. Some of them are complaining that they could have done better had they gerrymandered. And why are only the blue states doing independent redistricting and kind of giving up the fight to Republican states that are happy to gerrymander? So, well,
that's very true. But I'd say the effect of that plan was to help Democrats. But yes, you're right. If they'd have done it in the legislature, they could have picked up at least 5 or 6 more seats than they actually did this year. I also want to point out that the state redistricting commission is evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans, with then 4 seats going to the independents, 14-member districts, and 14-member commission. The commissions that are being established in local governments, counties in California, one by one, are weighted towards the majority party of those counties. It's a different thing altogether. And that's what a lot of Democrats would like to do with the state commission, saying, hey, there are twice as many Democrats as there are Republicans in California. We should have twice as many seats on the redistricting commission as the Republicans do in California. So if they would make a change, it would be something along those lines of weighting the thing toward the voter registration the way they do in these county commissions in Southern California, weighting it towards the majority party. And if the Supreme Court would give the state the power to change that in that decision, that's probably what they would do. Rather than just simply grabbing it back to the legislature altogether, they would probably change the redistricting commission to be weighted towards the majority party.
I want to, we're only got a few minutes left. I want to jump with the question, and I think we have one from Kathy Abernathy. I believe Kathy's from Kern County, Bakersfield. I hope I have that right. She's asking about, is it time to reassess California's environmental legislative record to make some changes so fires don't destroy entire cities, et cetera, like a return to burning dead wood in forests, clearing roads for fire trucks, letting the lumber industry reestablish itself. I mean, one of the things that what I've read in terms of the policy has been fire suppression and not letting the nature just do its business and take out old deadwood by just letting fires just go as they've done in the past. And that's actually exacerbated the problem. What are the thoughts on it? The legislature one bad fire season, and this is all going to be front and center. Legislature thinking about doing anything along these lines, being a little proactive on this?
I think that there has been a change of sentiment in terms of policy towards wildfires, of in some cases letting fires burn if they're not doing any damage to humans, or actually going out and doing forest thinning and controlled burns to try to get the fires in California are made worse by all the underbrush in these forests. all this dead wood. They think that's what does the fires. And finally, the firefighting community is finally said, well, yeah, maybe we need to eliminate some of this fuel before the fact rather than let it flame up in a destructive way. So I think there is that change of policy going on right now.
I would just add that I think this is an area where the difference between the plans they make and what they actually do is really important, because Newsom, I got to give credit to Capital Public Radio, which is the NPR affiliate here in Sacramento, has done some extraordinary work showing how so many of the plans that have been approved and budgeted to do some of this, work to clear brush, to make roads passable, to thin forests, has been approved, has been discussed, but has not actually been completed. And so I think that's an important thing too, of just kind of to make sure that the government's not just talking about making changes, but actually doing them.
Yeah, I think the governor got over his skis when he was talking about this a little while ago, and it wasn't quite as what he was saying. Let's put it that way. Anyway, I want to be respectful of people's time. We're up against 1 o'clock. I want to thank our guests, Laurel Rosenhall with the LA Times, the Sacramento bureau chief, recently appointed, by the way. But she's been in Sacramento for a long time. We're absolutely delighted she's in that position. And of course, Dan Walters, the stalwart of Capitol politics. Always enjoyable having you on. Thanks, everyone. We have a robust plan of a lecture series in 2023. So stay tuned by reading the Maddy Daily or logging onto our website to see when those will be occurring in the new year. Want to wish everyone a very Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays, and we'll see you in 2023.